anyone has any corrections to those or would like to move approval of them.
So move.
Second.
Thank you, Mel. Second from John. All right, any corrections or comments on the minutes? All right, hearing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. All right, we have just a single information item, but it should result in quite a bit of conversation. And we'd like to introduce Jeanette Duren with PAG, who will talk to us about the 2045 RMAP. And I understand, Jeanette, that we will be, you'll be pausing from time to time in the presentation to allow for questions and comments. So look forward to your presentation and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the CAC. My name is Jeanette Duren, and I'm here to talk to you today about long-range transportation planning. As Mr. Chair said, we will take some pauses throughout the presentation, and Paul is also here with me today, and he will provide some insights as well. So why do we do long-range transportation planning at PAG? The simple answer is that it is a federal requirement. But beyond being a federal requirement, there are a lot of benefits to doing long-range planning. Mainly, it involves everybody. It ensures that everybody involved that everybody's involved in the planning process. That's especially important for our Title VI minority and disadvantaged community members. But because it's a participatory process, it really is comprehensive. It also helps us identify strategies that ensure ample funding and timely project delivery. And it uses a coordinated approach to meet the transportation needs of the region. And what I mean by a coordinated approach is that all jurisdictions participate in the long-range planning process. So PAG's long-range plan is also known as the Regional Mobility and Accessibility Plan, also known as the RMAP. So you'll hear me refer to RMAP, and that's really what I'm talking about, is that published planning document. Our document is required by a federal mandate that we have to update it every 4 years. So the original RMAP was approved in 2016, and it has to have a minimum of a 20-year planning horizon per that federal regulation. Ours had a 25-year planning horizon. The one key theme you're going to hear throughout my presentation is this term fiscal constraint. And so what that means is we are mandated to align our future revenue projections and our project list. So our project list is one of the deliverables that comes out of the long-range plan. And that list has to be constrained to a reasonably anticipated revenue. And I'll explain that more throughout the presentation. There's also a federal requirement for air quality conformity, but most importantly, we designed the RMAP to be a flexible document. That way we can accommodate the changing needs of the region throughout that planning horizon. Late last year, in 2020, we approved an update to the RMAP. So I'll refer to that as the 2045 RMAP update. And what came of that really was just an update of the data that goes into the long range plan. So we focused on updating our demographic data, which would be our population and employment projections. And we updated that revenue projection. And for the first time, we conducted what's called a performance report, which I'll explain later in the presentation. It's important to note, though, that in our 2045 RMAP update, we really stuck to the parameters of that 2016 plan. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. And But one of the big things that we do in every long range plan is we re-examine that project list to make sure it's the most relevant project list moving forward. So it's key to understand the role of the long range plan in the process of executing projects throughout the region. So it really is a high level planning document that encompasses many other activities throughout the region. So the key piece to keep in mind is that the RMAP is sort of the parent document by which projects come through the TIP, which the TIP is our programming document. So that's more of your implementation tool. So for a project to receive funding and ultimately be built, it has to show up in that RMAP project list. So the RTA fits in because the RTA is a subset of that larger project list that's tied to a specific funding source. So if you think about it, if we're going to put money towards executing a project, towards building something or executing a program, it needs to show up in that RMAP in-plan project list. So I'm going to pause right there and ask Paul. Paul, do you have anything to add?
Don't really have anything to add right now. This is a great place to dwell because the relationship between the different instruments, plans, and programs can get a bit confusing. So what's important to remember here about the RTA program is that there is a commitment to deliver those projects. So there's specific sales tax generated funding attributed to those projects. Other projects throughout the RMAP, as Jeanette will kind of provide an overview for, aren't necessarily fund specific. We need to make sure we have enough collections in order to deliver on the project list within a long range plan. And we have to make sure that the transit funds go to transit endeavors and things of that nature. But that RTA commitment is really a vitally important piece to remember. And then the TIP itself is the programming mechanism when dollars are actually put into the program to execute the design and construction of a project. That is the TIP process.
All right, thanks, Paul. So really to kind of put it broadly, the process for developing the long range plan really focused on public participation and stakeholder input. So when it started, a stakeholder task force was created to really drive and guide the planning process. PAG established a set of existing conditions. A lot of that data you've seen come through many of these presentations, but really we're looking at our population and employment forecasts, our land use and roadway conditions, and all those pieces of data that help drive the process. One of the really sort of state-of-the-art wonderful things that we created was this Engage 2045 tool. And what that tool did was it was a public engagement platform that we used to pull in feedback from the community. And we were actually able to get over 3,000 participants in using that Engage tool. And one of the great things that that tool did, and we can talk about it as we move forward, was that it helped us compare different investment packages. So people could go in there and look at their different priorities and look at where they wanted the goals to go and see how the investment funds changed. So it really was a dynamic and interactive tool. And from that, the vision, goals, and performance measures that are in the plan kind of were the result of that effort. From that, we got together and we developed the project list. And then once those projects came in for the project list, they were refined. And remember, I mentioned earlier that fiscal constraint. So we get all the projects that come in and we look at them and we decide, okay, how can we meet that fiscally constrained list? So not every project that came in or every idea that came in wound up on the project list. It was really honed in and refined. So this is the vision. This is the vision that came from that effort. And from that vision, 11 goals were formed. And I'll show you those goals here in a minute. But importantly is that 7 of those goals included performance measures. And those performance measures were really a way that we can track whether or not we're successfully accomplishing those goals. So it built in that ability to track our performance, to track towards those targets. And I have some depictions, some graphs of that I'll show you here in a minute. And also 98 implementation strategies came forth. So as you can see, it's really robust, and it accompanied a lot of different aspects of transportation planning. So with that, before we get into performance-based planning and programming, Paul, did you have anything else that you'd like to add?
Just a couple things. Performance-based planning, that track to target functionality that Jeanette has referenced has been kind of a long time coming, and it does allow us to consider those areas that are performing well and those areas where we're not necessarily on target to hit what our desired outcome by 2045 is. And so it allows for adjustments within that repeated 4-year cycle where we can look at, well, it looks like we need to do more to alleviate congestion because we're behind that target, for example. That's just one example. But allowing that track to target functionality allows us to hone in and develop a sharper long-range plan that can better address the needs of the community and the performance that's taking place.
That's right.
Chair, Mr. Chair. This is
Yes.
Carolyn. Is this a time to ask questions, or would you like me to wait?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Okay, thanks. Just for clarification in terms of RMAP versus what we're doing here. So there was a stakeholder process that created the RMAP, and then the update was done, I assume, through all the committees and up to the board. And did anything change from what the citizens came up with in that process other than the revenue projections? Do you drop out projects that have already been completed, or how does it work in terms of update? What do you have updated exactly?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, so I have a slide later in the presentation where I talk about exactly how we changed the project list, but you're right. So projects that were completed fell off the list. Also, projects that were no longer viewed as a priority moved into what we call our reserve list. So the RMAP has an in-plan project list, and that's our fiscally constrained project list. And it has a reserve list, which is the best way I explain it is sort of like it's the B list. So those are projects that in a perfect world with an endless bucket of money, we would also do those projects. But because projects need to be in the RMAP to eventually move into the TIP, we keep that that reserve list in case we need to move projects back and forth. So yeah, that's one of the steps when we did the update. We looked at that in-plan project list and that reserve list, and some projects moved back and forth. But none of the projects disappeared completely unless they were completed projects.
Okay, but if the citizens put them into the main list, the staff decided for whatever reason to put them in the reserve list, but they're all still able to be funded, which brings me to my next question, because I know I've asked this a couple of times before, but the RTA, CAC, and the board can only approve projects that are already, for RTA funding, that are already in the RMAP, whether they're in tier 1 or the reserve list, right?
No, actually for RTA Next, new projects can be brought forward. So it's not just restricted to projects that are in the existing RMAP. So if through the RTA Next process, a new project comes up, that can be incorporated into the next long range plan. So it's kind of interesting because the long range planning process happens on this mandated 4-year time cycle. So, all these other planning efforts in the region happen in that 4 years. So we try to incorporate them as we go. And we will be looking at the projects as RTA Next advances to make sure that those the RMAP kind of keeps up with where those projects are headed.
Okay, well, and you'll probably get into this, so I apologize. And I had another question after that, but so, because I was involved with the citizens process. So our citizens process basically trumps the original citizens process, as does whatever the staff and or the jurisdictions or board wants to do, which I have mixed feelings about, because one, it's a long time frame, so of course things are going to change, but it's not a static document, so depending on how many changes there are, it ceases to be that plan that was approved by our stakeholder process and the public, it sounds like. But the very last question, because I'm taking up way too much time, is how often does the TIP meet, and does that change a lot? And is that where projects go from the tier 1 to the tier 2, I'll call it?
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
And then I'll be quiet.
No, it's okay. No, I appreciate the
Promises.
You're doing fine, Carolyn.
Okay, watch.
Well, one thing I'll point out is that it doesn't, the RTA process doesn't trump like the public process that happened through the RMAP, because if you remember, the RMAP is sort of the higher level. It's the overarching transportation plan, and RTA is sort of a subsection of it. So the citizen process that you guys are going through now is really just to focus on that one funding stream. And because the RMAP is updated every 4 years, we're re-evaluating the changing needs of the community. So as projects are delivered and circumstances change, that plan evolves along with it. So I wouldn't say that one trumps the other, because it's just a continuing evolution. The TIP is, so that's our programming document. That's when money is allocated from specific funding sources to an actual project. So that happens every other year. And so projects will be added to that, in every TIP cycle. So projects, usually take more than 1 or 2 years to design and deliver. So you'll see a project start in 1 year, and then over the course of the subsequent years, different phases of the project. So every time we re-examine the TIP, new projects will start up. And so that's kind of the feeding mechanism to the actual project implementation.
And Mr. Chair, it's Arlen. I've got another follow-up question.
Yes, Arlen.
Thanks. Carolyn asked, Carolyn asked one of the questions that I wanted to get at, so I get the relationship. But a couple of things. One, if through the RTA process, we all come up with, let's say, just say 3 projects that are not on the RMAP, does that assume, and those get approved, does that assume that some of the RMAP projects are going to now, because those are priority projects, because they're going to have funding, will shift down into the reserve list from the, we're going to do them sooner? That's one question.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'll answer that one first. So kind of yes and no. One is that a lot of the projects that we're seeing being submitted through the jurisdictions are already projects that are in the RMAP. So right. There could be new projects. So yes, and we have seen a few, desires for new projects to come in. So a lot is going to be dependent on that revenue projection. So in the 2016 RMAP, for instance, the revenue projection was about $17 billion. When we updated it last year, it's $15 billion. So in 4 years, when we update it again, we'll have to see what our revenue projection is, and then how much those new projects are going to cost. So yeah, we anticipate some shifting. But yeah, if it ends up in the RTA, you can guarantee it's going to end up in the RMAP. So there'll have to be adjustments made.
And then the second
That's
question,
a natural function of the iterative process of doing this every 4 years. Toward the end of RMAP update, we were beginning to hear from the jurisdictions, ooh, I want to make adjustments, because they're constantly considering what projects are most appropriate in some of those out years. We have to kind of stop the clock and tell them, we'll do that at the next round, bear in mind your project's not going to be out in the cold. We'll get it in there as we need to in order to have funding programmed to it, but we can't just add new projects each and every month. We have to stop when the jurisdictions can work with us to do that. We're not concerned about new stuff coming from RTA Next into the long range plan. We have mechanisms by which we can incorporate it through the next RMAP development, or if absolutely necessary, we can amend the current RMAP update. We don't think we're going to need to do that, but we're ready to do any of those steps if we need.
And the second question, follow up is, are there, not that I need the details, but just in concern in general, are there any other sources of projects that function in the way that RTA does relative to the RMAP? In other words, any other programs that can come up with projects that could replace or push around projects in the RMAP the same as the RTA can?
There's nothing similar to RTA in so much as that there's a set of projects that's tied to a specific funding source like RTA is. So that's kind of where it's kind of its own animal, because it's tied to that funding source. So, I mean, we're not going to see anything wholeheartedly kind of come in and upset the apple cart, if you will. But, you know, that being said, you know, every 4 years we're looking at this. So different plans and programs come through that we evaluate towards the project list in every cycle.
And then just real quick, the third question that goes back to a previous slide, just to double check the population numbers and employment numbers for 2045. Those are, whatever that is, that's the state approved allocated number, a control number. Is that correct?
That's correct. So those numbers do come from the state demographer's office, but they also come through approval in the PAG committees as well. So
Right.
we bring those numbers forward, and you've seen them come up at different committee meetings.
I'm just checking this, that it's all coordinated and organized.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's all the same, all the same.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Are there any other questions before we move on? Okay, we'll move forward then. So as we started to discuss, our RMAP is a performance-based planning tool, and we are committed to doing performance-based planning and programming here at PAG. And really what that means is that our approach drives investment and implementation strategies to accomplish specific goals and objectives. So we're really looking at data and how we're achieving our goals and driving to those targets. So we're implementing our plan in a really coordinated and focused approach. So performance measures are how we execute that data-driven performance-based planning and programming. So through the FAST Act, through that federal mandate, there are performance measures that we have to track. So we have to follow. In this list, these are some of the things that we have to follow. So, you know, we it seems like, okay, well, you know, we're just doing this because we have to. But at the end of the day, we're not just tracking these things to meet that federal mandate. They're also very helpful in tracking the success of our plan. So there was a reason why these were kind of delivered to us. Goals and implementation strategies were developed to incorporate these specific measures into the outcome. So because we have to measure these things, we did incorporate that into the goals and strategies of the RMAP plan. So in addition to those FAST Act required performance measures, there are regionally identified performance measures. So these are in addition to those FAST Act required measures, these are other ones that we measure. This example is 4 different performance measures under the system performance goal. So you can see that every performance measure has a baseline performance, which is sort of like your existing condition at that point in time. And it has a target performance, which is where we want to be. What is that target for that implementing that goal, for achieving that goal? And then of course you see the actual performance. So that's just our trend. Okay, so our performance measures are directly tied to the goals in the RMAP. So on the left column, you can see some of our goal areas. And then the middle column shows performance measures that we are on track to meet. So those targets, we're on track to achieving those targets for those measures. On the right is a list of performance measures that we're not quite tracking to target yet. So those are ones that we're going to keep our eye on moving forward. Okay, so one of the really great things that we're also able to accomplish through having this performance-based approach is that we're able to evaluate the combined benefits of our project list. So we can look at that project list and kind of predict a little bit, if you will, on how we're going to achieve those goals. What is it exactly we're going to address? So this infographic shows that, for instance, we're going to touch upon 30 projects that are bridge rehabilitations to bridges that are in poor condition. We're going to address 85 intersections for safety, 209 miles of pavement, 109 miles of improvements to freight corridors. So this kind of gives you an idea of why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing what we're doing. I am going to take a quick pause right there and see if Paul has anything else to add.
So the previous slide, that's kind of the expression of what I was talking about, taking focus on what's not tracking to target. May shift some of the investment priorities by the board or considerations by partners on what types of projects to go after. So it's important that we keep track of that. That is iterative and allows us to kind of put a finger on the pulse of what's happening with the system and what we anticipate our needs are based on current performance. A lot of this content, keep in mind, Jeanette will get into this. We've served this to you at the project level, so we can push this to a project extent to show you performance information about a project area that for RTA Next candidate project that's being proposed, for example. So being allowed to do this at the network scale allows us to look at the combined value of an RMAP list. We can also look at different packages as we're evaluating different project packages moving forward. So it's really valuable for us in the planning process.
Yep, that's correct, Paul. And this is also a good place to pause and answer any questions that you might have about performance measures and our data-driven process.
Okay, I have another one, Mr.
Okay.
Chair.
Carolyn?
Yeah, so as far as the goals, the vision and goals of the original RMAP, do you, what do the meeting of the goals or not meeting, how does that affect the RMAP and everything, all the processes around it if you're not meeting the goals? Or if you've met the goals, do you make new goals? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how they're
Sure.
how they're related.
How it's all related, sure. So the vision, goals, and strategies that were set in the 2016 plan carried through. So we're currently operating under those goals and strategies. So when we updated the project list and created this graphic that you see, you know, we're looking at are we moving towards accomplishing those goals, or are we tracking towards them? Are we taking some steps to do that? And really evaluating our project list to say, okay, you know, we set forth this plan, are we going in that direction? So of course, when you're looking at, you know, so many goals and so many strategies, you know, we're making progress where we can. So then when we do our next process and we're looking at the next project list, we're going to go back and evaluate and say, you know, did we meet those goals? Are we tracking towards those goals? And evaluate where we are. So it's kind of in that 4-year cycle.
This is Mel Cohen. I have a, I guess, part question, part comment. The other chart that you showed, I was shocked to see that land use and transportation, no, the one with the graph, the meeting, that one, yes. So to me, the lack of jobs and housing reachable by transportation is, does everything get weighted equally? Because otherwise that to me needs to be addressed.
Sure. And, that's a really interesting one that you bring up, because jobs reachable by auto and jobs reachable by transit, we did just update our transit plan. And that part of that was to look at, how can we track towards that target? How can we move the needle forward? So there have been planning efforts along the way between these two cycles to try to address specific areas of performance. But you're right, that's a really critical one. And, as we continue to make investments, we need to watch these targets and see if we're tracking towards them.
And mind those are targets that are set for achieving by 2045. So we're tracking, are we on pace to do that? Those are specific increased numbers as it is. So the target itself, those targets need to be revisited to kind of take into account, did we do these right, or did we just kind of overshoot these? So being able to track to whether or not we're on target to reach that 2045 target is very helpful, not only for are we delivering the right projects to improve this, but also are these targets set properly, or do they need adjustment as we are looking again at another long range plan? So it allows us to do both of those things.
Can I follow up on that? I'm wondering what the federal process is for approval of the RMAP. Since it has to be submitted, I assume that there's some review process, and I'm also assuming that they're examining these performance measures, and perhaps is there a regular tracking of it from the federal side, or if they feel that it's unrealistic. Certainly we know if you can't convince them that you have a reasonable consideration of the amount of revenue coming in, that it won't be approved. But what about from the performance side?
Well, from the performance side, just a handful of these are federally required targets. So what we decided, what our staff recommended, and Carolyn and others involved in the technical advisory committee decided, that doesn't really give us a full picture of what the regional needs are. A lot of the federal targets will focus on interstate condition for whether it be pavement or travel time or freight time reliability. Knowing that we have a lot of system off of that national highway system, we felt we needed to go down deeper. So those particular targets, the vast majority of those are at the discretion of the region to say, we will do the federal side stuff, but we also want to track these other targets so that we can keep a full assessment of the condition of our network performance. The federal stuff doesn't quite get us all the way there. So the feds don't really scrutinize too much on the land use and transportation targets that have been selected and set by the regional stakeholder group. But the federal targets, they will certainly take a look at and make sure that we're in compliance and at least following the processes for setting those and revisiting them on a regular basis. Whether or not we're tracking toward them isn't necessarily a reason for feds to not approve the long range plan, but it could be something that shapes their comments to us.
It's also important to point out here too, that the whole performance measures topic and requirement, that when that came about versus when we started using them in our planning. So we actually included them in our 2016 plan, and that was prior to them being required by the Fed. So we were kind of ahead of the 8 ball there. And so when we did our 2020 plan and we did our performance report, that really was the first time that we not only had to track our performance in those areas, but also did a performance report. So we're really early in that whole ideology that was set forth from the Fed.
This is Arlen. I've got a comment, Mr. Chair. There's looking back to Mel's comment about the land use and transportation matter, which was one of my main issues and why I wanted to be involved in this committee. There's always the question of whether land use drives transportation or transportation drives land use, and the answer is yes, because they both do, right? So it's a two-way street. And since the land use components of what's happening in the valley are really determined by the local municipalities in the county, as opposed to PAG. PAG works more on the transportation side of thing. It seems unfair that it is just like, well, these transportation goals have to be met when a land use pattern exists that doesn't allow that to occur. So my suggestion is, and this isn't, I don't want to say a parking lot suggestion, but it's a move to action on behalf of the PAG staff to, as the general plans and the county comprehensive plan come up for review, which they will do within the next X number of years, to please engage. I would not have known anything about those particular goals, federal goals, and I could have used those in doing the county plan. I don't know how much I would have been able to do, but the same thing, I think, nobody talked to me about any of that. And I suspect that's the same case in most of the other jurisdictions as well. If we're going to really try to coordinate this thing on a regional basis, the plans, the land use and the plans have to shift and modify more infill, more towards transit and such, in order to make to meet that goal. It's not just about building transportation services. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
This is Dale Calvert. I got kind of a corollary question. Looking at the projected things the city comes, and I know we all have frustration with the fact that it's not there yet, but looking at there, for instance, there's one project in the city list, which basically is a boundary to boundary modification of Speedway to incorporate complete streets concepts. And how is that, if there's it appears to be a lot of those kind of projects in the city's proposed thing that went to the council. Does that change or impact this in any way? Or is that retroactively depending upon what gets adopted? And of course, another plan that's being talked about at the city, I have no idea whether it's going to get in there, is building a couple more GSIs on golf links and that. And how does that fit into the RMAP? And is that just going to be done retroactively, or how does that fit in? And of course, obviously, when you start talking about the complete streets concept, what Arlen was just talking about will be also impacted by those complete street concepts.
Sure. So there's a few questions there. I'll try to answer all of them with a few simple answers, but mainly, when we designed the RMAP, there was built-in flexibility. So there are just sort of like buckets of money sitting there that can be pulled from when we talk about complete street elements. So we do have sidewalks and bikeways and multi-use paths. That's all in the RMAP, and they're not prescribed to specific locations. So as jurisdictions bring forward their ideas, most of those can be accommodated in the RMAP as is. Some of those larger corridor projects, Speedway, those sorts of things, if they're not in the RMAP, they probably will be in the next one. So when we update this in 4 years, those projects will probably bubble to the surface because, priorities change and ideas change. So we'll see some of that. If a project is under kind of development right now, so if one of the jurisdictions is thinking through a project and they're scoping through that project, chances are we will update the RMAP before they're ready to deliver that project, before they're ready to actually design and execute that project. So usually the timing is in our favor. If for whatever reason, an idea came right away, it's not in the RMAP and we have to push it forward, then we would do an amendment to the RMAP. But because these projects don't come up quickly and happen quickly, we can kind of anticipate it and work within it. But, one of the kind of hallmarks of the RMAP was that flexibility, because we recognize that jurisdictions have different priorities that come up at different points throughout that 25-year planning horizon, and we try our best to accommodate those. Another point I want to make too, at the RMAP level, we're not really scoping projects to every single amenity in the project. So we kind of have a loose idea of how much a project's going to cost and what's going to go into it. But when we talk about individual amenities of a corridor project, for instance, we're not saying there's going to be 3 bus stops, 2 bus pullouts, certain kinds of intersections are those finite amenities. They really don't happen at that RMAP level. That starts happening at that TIP programming level. So we're kind of in a good place to accommodate those. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, for now anyway.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to continue forward. So we talked about our modeling and the data-driven approach. And I really want to point out that our modeling efforts are the backbone of our long-range plan. So I know Paul and Josh had presented on this before, but we really dig into those population and employment projections, and we build this land use model where we're looking at our land use patterns and how they're going to change over that plan horizon. So you probably remember seeing some of their maps where they showed the population and where the jobs are going to go and how our model sort of predicts those things. I want to point out too that when we do those efforts, when we go through that land use model, we work hand in hand with our jurisdictions to make sure that all the trends that they're seeing, all the rezonings, all the development plans, all the permits that are being pulled are incorporated into that land use model. And what that helps us do is not just sort of predict out in 20 years what we think, where we think land use is going. We can really base that on some firm data. And then of course we do our travel demand modeling. And I put these flow charts up there really just to show that it's complex. There's a lot that goes into it, and that it really is data driven. It's not just driven by, what we think might happen. Okay, so moving on into our finance plan, I brought this up before, but our finance plan really is a big piece, a big required piece of what we do. And that is one of our FAST Act requirements that comes right from the federal government. So we have that requirement for fiscal constraint in our current RMAP that we're working under. It's $15.1 billion. And in that we projected our revenue for all of our different funding sources. So if you remember back to last month's presentation by Nathan, where he talked about the different funding sources and their flexibility or inflexibility, this is what we're talking about. We got into every one of those funding sources, our federal, our state, our regional, our RTA, and our local funds, and we did a projection out for the entire length of our plan. So you can see kind of where some of those projections ended. So what the federal government requires is this reasonable expectation of funds. So when we do this revenue projection, they want it to be reasonable. They want us to really base that on something. And we've developed a methodology for looking at all those funding streams and coming up with the best way to create a realistic picture of how much money we're going to bring in. One of the things that they do look at is making sure this isn't a pie in the sky. We're going to bring in all this money and execute all these projects. They really want us to hone in on what's reasonable, which is good, because when we're setting an expectation for the community, we want to make sure that we're in the parameters of what's reasonable. Now, at the long range planning process, this is a challenge because simply because of the time horizon. So we're talking about 20, 30 years out, and where are we going to be with our revenue coming in? As we've seen over the past 10, 15, 20 years, some events in our economy are not always that predictable, and the impacts of those aren't always predictable. But we do our best to try to accommodate for all that. So when we're doing our revenue projections, we're looking at things like our total revenue, which is all of our different funding sources. And then we're looking at things like our committed revenue. So committed revenues are money like our RTA money that's already tied to executing specific projects. So it's committed to those projects. We're also looking at restricted revenue. Restricted revenues are revenue streams that come in for specific types of projects. So the easiest example here is transit money. So we get transit money. Those are restricted to transit projects only. So we're looking at those as well. And then of course, we're looking at our flexible funds, and those are funds that we're free to use on a variety of projects. But once again, I'm going to point out one more time that $15.1 billion revenue anticipated. But we also assumed that the half-cent sales tax would continue on through the horizon of the plan. So that was just one of the revenue assumptions we made. Okay, so I'll pause right there. And Paul, did you have anything else to add on the finance plan or revenue projections?
I think you covered it really well. Back to that, the question earlier, I think from Arlen, you'll notice that the local funds, even if there's a locally generated bond program or anything like that, that's kind of left into the local fund larger bucket. It's not specified bond package X or Y attributed to certain projects. We leave that up to the jurisdiction that's running that program, and we show it within the RMAP as that local fund fund source, and we kind of load a bunch of local funds together into that piece.
So Paul, if I understand right, the process of keeping these undeclared buckets, you know, for things like sidewalks and maybe bus pullouts and other amenities, if you will ultimately, when you consider that the RTA will also have its own buckets, result in us having kind of buckets A and B for bus pullouts, as an example, or for sidewalks, or for signals, or whatever it might be. Is that likely, and or is that the way you anticipate tracking those kinds of undefined expenses at this point?
So I guess, you know, maybe not fully undefined. We do need to constrain those types of categories. For example, a good example is technology. We don't exactly know what technology will be implemented to improve signal operations into the future, but we don't want that to necessarily be tied to Oro Valley's going to do this, and Marana's going to do that, and the city of Tucson's going to do this, and Pima County's going to do that. So we create a regional project for that says traffic signal technology upgrades. And then we work with the partner agencies and the technical advisory committee to make sure we're dialing that in properly in terms of the size of that package to allow enough flexibility, as Jeanette mentioned, for the jurisdictions to have that be the parent project for whatever signal project they want to move forward with into the tip. So we're not specifically tying it to a fund source per se, but if there are fund sources that come from the local jurisdiction for a proposition where there's a collection of revenues at the local level, it's incumbent upon that jurisdiction to make sure that they have the projects that are required to be delivered within that listed in the RMAP, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I was just trying to get at, you know, when we set a categorical, as an example, for safety or any other bucket, if you will, how defined we are is probably going to be a little different than how well defined the current RMAP bucket is. Does that cause any kinds of issues, or is it something we need to keep in mind as we're doing that?
I don't think it's anything you need to keep in mind right yet, in that the condition remains, as Jeanette said, what is developed as part of RTA Next can be incorporated into the RMAP in either the next RMAP, or if absolutely necessary, we can run through an amendment process. So you don't need to really be too concerned with that. We do inherently try to build in that flexibility so that we can say there's a complete streets package rather than these specific complete streets corridors that are going to take place, that we know those corridors may shift around through a 2045 horizon. So we don't want to say these specific corridors and then realize, oh, there's a corridor desired for complete streets amenities that's not listed. Now we have to go through an arduous amendment process. So we lump it into a complete streets program of sorts that's multi-jurisdictional. And then as the corridors or the amenities get defined coming in the nearer term and through the TIP process, that's when it really becomes a project and those distinct characteristics get identified.
Well, it sounds like they may also get defined through the RTA Next process.
Indeed,
You know, if the city of Tucson wants to and is successful in getting a number of complete streets named projects, then then that will certainly contribute, I guess, to which ones are included in the TIP as an example, or held for later when we know more about the corridors.
Indeed. And just as a reminder, just to remind the CAC, what's been requested of the sponsor agencies is only those named project level components. So we haven't really talked about, do we need a complete streets? Do we need technology for signals? That's not in yet. What we're seeing in any draft list coming from the jurisdictions is limited to those specific named projects.
Okay, thank you.
And that really leads right into the next slide. You know, we talk about this universe of projects and where do these projects come from? And really it is a multi-layered process, and projects come from all different sources. These are some examples where we're pulling projects that are coming from regional studies and modal plan, area, jurisdiction, infrastructure plans and studies, general and comprehensive plans. There they are. Arlen mentioned our comprehensive planning process. So we do look at what are in those jurisdiction plans and we pull from them. Also corridor studies and jurisdictional assessments and requests. So what that really is getting at is that, you know, throughout the planning process, we're pulling from these different sources, from these different efforts, and that sort of feeds into the formation of that project list. And, you know, to kind of get back to what you were talking about, the different elements, you know, what we do know about transportation planning is that, you know, we start to see themes throughout the years, and we see these different elements, and, you know, we try to make sure that, you know, we're pretty forward thinking. We're thinking about what elements go into our complete streets, what goes into multimodal corridors, and we make sure that those are in the plan in some way, shape, or form. The other thing, I mentioned it earlier, and it's worth saying again, is that, you know, we don't really scope out these corridor projects to the individual amenity. And so that does give the jurisdictions the flexibility to design their own projects. So, you know, we're not sitting here trying to dictate to the jurisdiction what their project needs to include. They're coming to us and we're trying to accommodate that. Okay, so when we updated the project list, this kind of gets back to what you were asking, Carolyn, like what are we looking at when we look at our project list and we update it? So one thing that we do, and it's really critical to what we, when we incorporate RTA projects, is we look at cost estimates. So a project that's been in the plan for 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, the initial cost estimate versus, you know, what the cost would be now, those change. And so we re-examine that and we adjust accordingly. We also look at all the projects coming in from ADOT. So they do their programs and plans, and we incorporate that in as well. Of course, we get rid of completed projects because they're done, so we don't have to keep them on the list. We look at the public feedback and make sure that these trends that we're hearing about are all part of our plan. And then, of course, like I mentioned earlier, we look at that in plan and reserve project list, and we make sure that if something's on the reserve, it needs to go on in plan, or vice versa, that we make those adjustments accordingly. And that's really a hand-in-hand process with our jurisdictions, because they're going to tell us whether a project is a priority anymore or if it's not. So we're responsive to that. And then also, like I mentioned before, we look at projects from different efforts, so from different planning efforts. And the easiest one to tie to our last update was that long-range transit plan. So projects and programs and how we deliver transit was reimagined, and it was also there was a stakeholder engagement process and a public participation process. So the outcome of that planning effort was folded into the RMAP update. And so we'll continue to do that as we move forward with the next RMAP. We'll continue to look at these planning efforts and folding them in to the long range plan. So to keep track of that, to keep track of all of our projects, we developed what we call the RMAP Project Explorer, and it really is it's our data platform. It is where we aggregate all of our data and analyze the existing conditions of our roadway network. So it's a web platform where we can go in and take a look at all these different moving parts for our transportation network. And what we're doing is we're taking all this data that we have and we're pushing it out onto the network so we can start to look at different projects, different roadways, and look at our entire network and see how we're performing in different areas. So this is an example of one project, the report that we can pull for one project. This example is Tangerine from Dove Mountain to the interstate. And this probably looks very familiar because this is the same sort of report that Pocky and Rick and Paul had shown to you guys on the corridor projects that came into the RTA Next portal already. So what it allows us to do is to look at all of our existing conditions, to look at all of our performance, and to take a deeper dive into analyzing that project and the impacts that it might have. So this is the same information that they were showing to you on those corridor projects. So another feature of the Explorer tool is our ability to start doing some scenario planning. And it's a feature of the Explorer where we can start looking at packages of projects and whole sets of projects and do some scenario planning. And in this example, you can see where it says score 1, score 2, score 3. That was an exercise to look at, if we examine a scenario, how is that going to impact our implementation? So what it doesn't do is it doesn't spit out a list of projects and say, if you want to achieve these goals, do these projects. It starts to do that. So it starts to show us how a proposed package of projects would perform and how we could reach those goals. But then we take a step back and look at equity, for instance. Are these projects covering, the entire region? What are the economic impacts of those projects, and so on and so forth? So it really is a starting point where we can start to really analyze these different scenarios. And I'm going to just stop right there and see if Paul has anything to add. He was
a couple of great points to add here. So this was originally built into our long range plan initiative. But what you should know is the content that we're able to serve up to the CAC while it's built upon this, we have essentially a mirror platform specific to RTA Next. So we're serving that to the jurisdictions so that they can look at existing condition performance as they're considering their candidate projects in an effort to determine the best opportunities for performance improvement. So we're able to do that with the jurisdictions. Jeanette mentioned cost estimation. As part of this and as part of RTA Next, we've standardized the approach to planning level cost estimation so that we have a better starting place if the jurisdictions have done more detailed work to evaluate the scope of a project and have better numbers, we'll defer to them certainly, but they've been giving us great feedback on our planning level cost estimate tool, providing them a much better starting place for knowing the scope and scale of a project cost as they move forward. When Jeanette mentions the different scores that are considered, that's an area where adjustment can be made to scoring methodology in the case that there is a performance area that is one of those lagging areas. There can be prioritization that shifts between safety and mobility or facility maintenance, pavement types of things, depending on what the intention is and what the package is. So there's flexibility in that evaluation of different scoring approaches that exists as well. We haven't really gotten too deep into that since RMAP, but it's a functionality we do have.
Thanks. Paul, we do have a question from John Holden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the question is, are these charts and such available for the public to consume and or add comments to?
So we're typically serving this up for the project sponsors themselves as a consideration as they're scoping projects for inclusion. We've served them up for the RTA Next candidate projects for the Citizen Advisory Committee. And as we get closer to, a large list of projects and we begin to make that more manageable for expected RTA Next revenues, we can certainly consider how to serve up some of this performance data. But we do run a little risk of the fire hose syndrome. We don't want to send the public in here to try to make sense of lots of metrics that are being served up. We go through a fairly arduous training process with our sponsor agencies so they can understand what these performance numbers are and how they're being reported. And then they're regularly in communication with us so that they can pepper us with any questions and understand it even more clearly. So we're a bit hesitant to just serve it right out to the public. We can certainly consider packaging it in the right way and serving it up as candidate projects begin to move forward and get from a larger list down to a more manageable list.
All right, thank you, Paul.
And it's
All
important.
right, Carolyn, do you have a comment? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jen.
Oh, that's okay. So what we do serve up to the public though is the project list and the performance measures. So when you look at where, all those red and green and yellow boxes, that's talking about our performance. All that is available in the actual adopted plan. So you can kind of get your hands on the results.
Thank you, Jeanette. Perfect.
All right, Carolyn.
Yeah, just a comment or observation, a couple of them. I mean, what this really emphasizes to me is a couple of things. One is, as a subset of the public, and our task is really important, what we're doing. And so it seems like we need to really know this RMAP and these different, measures, whether they're the scoring or performance measures, et cetera, like the staff does, and which of course is a full-time job. I don't know if anybody other than maybe Tom and Dale, it sounds like, really know this stuff like we should, because it would not do a service to the RTA Next for us not to. So maybe that's just a suggestion to all of us to drop everything we're doing for the next couple of years. But the other thing that it emphasizes to me, and I really want to suggest this to our committee, is that we have regular dialogue with the jurisdiction so we can get feedback from them, not just when they give us presentations, which I think has only happened once. And I know we're kind of waiting for the city to give us their list officially, but the TMC, I assume, is still meeting, and instead of every other week, maybe we can have a joint meeting with them on an ongoing basis, starting pretty soon, because a lot of this is input, obviously, from the jurisdictions, but we're not having a dialogue with them, even though we're supposed to be kind of tag teaming back and forth with TMC. And I know we have a couple, or maybe just John now, representatives from that committee, but a full dialogue over this kind of format would be incredibly useful. That's all.
Mr. Chair and Carolyn, yeah, so that's a good point that you make, that, you know, to look at the performance measures and how the projects are performing. So when the jurisdiction submitted into the RTA Next project portal, it's the same, it's very similar to what you're seeing here, where we can then take that data that's been pushed on the network and we can see, you know, where that project is going to address performance. So I think that Paul and Rick and Pocky had kind of gone through some of those submissions that we got from the county and Marana, Sahuarita, et cetera, and started to look at, you know, how those are going to address performance. So yeah, that'll be a tool that's available for you guys to keep looking at as you guys develop the RTA Next.
Okay, good, thank you. And Mel Cohen has a question or a comment.
I have a question as two parts. Are you able to model what alternatives may, how they may impact, for instance, a grade separated exchange at Campbell and Grant, or you know, bus lanes to the Sonora corridor? Are you able to take data and then look at specific planning tools?
So as we kind of went over in the November session when I presented with Josh, our modeling capability really is at the network level from our agency. So we can look at a package of projects that would include GSIs and bus amenities and things of that nature, and we can understand how those will impact the network from largely a congestion perspective. If you want to get down to the individual project level, you're going to need different tools in order to do that. So where our performance measures kind of hand off is that we feel that we're doing a really good job serving up the existing condition performance information. There are a couple exceptions, such as a model for future congestion of the roadway network that does come from our model, but largely, by and large, the performance measures are existing condition data, and our modeling effort is network wide. So we can look at packages and say, package A results in these forecasted conditions for whatever the horizon date, whether it be 2045 or from that, we can look at that. We don't really have the tools and capability to get down to the individual project level with the work that we currently do. And that's largely done at an individual jurisdiction, or some of the engineering consulting firms specialize in that kind of work.
Okay, thank you. And Arlen, you have a comment?
Yeah, just a question. I'm looking at the chart in front of me, and there's a lot of information here. I don't really understand what it means, but it's okay. I don't need to right now. But the RMAP status and proposed status columns, it begs the question or comment, did we, when we were looking at individual projects and you had us going through and trying to decide what was important and what wasn't important in that initial list, I think last summer, was the RMAP inclusion or non-inclusion listed on that chart?
It was not listed on the chart that you guys saw, but we're looking at those projects as they come in. We've noticed that most of them are in the RMAP. There are some exceptions. And we've also noticed that some of the project parameters are changing from what we saw in the RMAP to what we're seeing submitted from the jurisdictions in the RTA Next. But yeah, so this picture is probably a little bit confusing because it has that RMAP status. So that was the status in the 2016 plan. And
Right.
then the proposed in plan where it says proposed status, that's where it wound up in the 2020 plan.
Got it. So my suggestion is going to be, and unless this already exists, I think it would be useful if we take the 2045 RMAP update in plan project list and identify what, maybe with just another column and a asterisk or a star or something, identify which projects are even available to be considered under RTA, or what are projects that have been brought forward and considered under RTA, knowing that this will change as we get the city information in, but just when we do, so that we understand from this RMAP list, looking just at that, what's even in our wheelhouse to deal with, what we're not dealing with, and whether or not, maybe in some cases there's a partial, or it's potentially partial funded from RTA versus full or something like that. But some indication there, we can see this list in terms of how it relates then to RTA. Having the information of individual projects going, whether they're in a plan in the RMAP or not, is great. But looking at the RMAP as a whole and then seeing what we're talking about. I don't even know what percentage of the RMAP RTA projects is. I really have no idea. So that's just a suggestion, not right this second, but down the road when we get city projects in to look at.
It's
Yeah,
probably 2 out of 15, right? I mean, $15 billion of revenue and maybe 1.8 or 2 billion from.
That was that $2.3 billion
RTA.
number that Jeanette showed for
Right.
the life of RMAP update.
Yeah. And it's not, I wasn't so much looking at the dollars per se, but just
Sure.
the actual projects on this list. That would.
We can serve that up. One of the important takeaways that we want to make sure the CAC realizes is that don't be restricted by what's in RMAP update. If there are project needs that come forward and they're not reflected in RMAP update, that should not stop the CAC from considering those projects. We
Right.
can show you if they've already been considered or not, but don't put a firm stop on that by any means.
Yeah, understand. It's more of a benchmark as to where
Yeah,
the
indeed.
goal is. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's something we will continue to look at, especially as that RTA Next project list does kind of, get further refined and, we start to really dig into those projects. We can kind of look more closely at the RMAP alignment. But just to give you a little perspective, your RTA, it's hard to say how many projects are going to be in the RTA Next, but, we're looking at maybe 30 projects, give or take, right? The entire RMAP has 193 projects. So you can really see that it is just a subsection, a sub portion of all the projects that wind up in the plan.
No, absolutely understand. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. This is just the result
Very good.
of,
Thank you.
this is just the result of the RMAP and how the projects, the investments will be split amongst the different types of road elements. So that's just the result. But to really summarize that project list, as I just mentioned, there was 193 projects in that project list. And of course, we did meet our $15.1 billion of fiscal constraint. So moving on, what does all this mean for the RTA Next? So we started to have this conversation a little bit as we move forward. But, why are we here presenting all this to you? Well, one is that, these are citizen-driven processes. So we are going to honor that as we move forward with our long-range planning process to make sure that, we are reflecting all these different efforts. We anticipate changes to the RMAP based on the RTA Next process. So we're going to, we gauge all this and make sure that as we move forward, that these discussions and these values kind of continue through the planning process. We know that our lists are going to change. RTA Next is going to drive the RMAP project list in some ways. Those projects are going to wind up on the in-plan list because they are going to receive committed funds. So we'll have to make sure that all that aligns. It's all part of that. What is the future of transportation of the roadway network in the region look like? So, we work hand in hand. Our timeline, like I mentioned before, we're kind of stuck in that 4-year cycle where we have that federal requirement to update this every 4 years. And so we have to sort of anticipate a little bit on where RTA Next is headed and when that might fall into the cycle. But, we can't slow down or speed up based on any other planning efforts. So we have to work together to make sure that we align. And also, we take into consideration the RTA cost estimating really closely because we want to make sure our plan has the most accurate cost estimates. And, RTA is our flexible funding source. So it's really helpful in executing the needs of our region. And, that money can be used in a multitude of different ways. So we want to make sure that that flexibility that we build into the RMAP is also in consideration to where RTA Next is headed as well. So we have to consider a whole multitude of things moving forward in our long range planning process. These are just a few of them, but maybe some of the most important. One is changes in our federal requirements. So as I've given this presentation, I talked to you about certain things that are these federal mandates that we have to do. And we anticipate that those are going to change. They've changed throughout, the many different planning cycles or many different 4-year cycles. And we'll have to keep our eye on them to see, are there going to be new requirements that we have to achieve? We're also going to re-examine our performance measures, as Paul mentioned. We're going to look at that data, make sure we have the best data sets, that we have data sets that are the best ones towards examining specific performance. So maybe there's new data or a more accurate set or a different way to gauge that performance that we can incorporate into our next effort. We're also going to keep our eye out on funding sources. So hopefully, ideally, there'll be new funding streams coming in, and we want to make sure that our region gets as much of that money as we can. We're also looking at new and emerging technology. So the presentation that Paul and Josh gave back in the fall, those are considerations that we're going to have to dive into deeper and look more specifically at as we move forward into the next RMAP. We're also conducting some more advanced modeling, and I know they had spoke to that before, but we really are on the cutting edge of what we call activity-based modeling. And so we're going to continue driving that data-driven approach and making sure that we're doing the best we can when we look at using that data to assess what we're trying to accomplish here in the region. Also, we're going to be looking at all those updated planning efforts. So RTA Next and what the jurisdictions are doing. And remember, I talked about that multi-layered area where we pull projects from, where we kind of pull to create that universe of projects. So we're, of course, going to keep our eyes and ears open for what's coming our way. And of course, public input. We're constantly gauging where projects and programs are headed and making sure that those considerations are also folded into our next RMAP. So where are we with the RMAP now? We just approved in September 2020, we approved the updates, but that doesn't mean we're done. We've already actually started moving towards the next update. And what that really means is that we've started establishing those existing conditions again and updating that data and building our advanced modeling approach with our activity-based model. So we're continuing to update that data, and you're seeing it being used for RTA Next, but we don't just do that once every 4 years. As that information becomes available, we continue to update. We're also going to continue to gauge our revenue and make sure that we're on track and we're keeping our revenue projections and our cost estimates in check, and we're updating that financial plan along the way. Of course, gauging the public input, that's an ongoing process, which we're going to be, tracking what RTA Next does, as well as other planning efforts to make sure that those things are all being addressed. And of course, updating that universe of projects. So as I mentioned before, and as we've discussed, projects usually don't just pop up and fall into our plan. We look around and see where they're coming from and fold it all in and make sure that it's all there. So we've already started, we're already working towards our next 4-year update. So with that, that's all I have for you today. But of course, we're here to answer questions. Anything that you'd like to add, Paul?
I think you did a great job. The hand-in-hand nature of the RMAP and RTA Next, that's a really important component. These things are not done separately, they're done in conjunction.
Jeanette and Paul, for those of the CAC who would like to really dig deeper into the RMAP, maybe Pocky could send us a direct link to it, or you can explain to the committee where they can find that, especially those details that we've talked about today that may not necessarily show up in an overview type of locale.
Sure. So yeah, the RMAP is on our website. I've put the link here, and I'm sure Pocky can also guide you to it as well. And of course, feel free to reach out to us directly and we can kind of guide you towards information. There's also a video on our website that kind of walks through this as well. So it might also help kind of give you a better framework for what we're doing.
And on that website, you'll find both the 2016 RMAP that goes out to 2045 and the update that was just completed and finalized in September. So in the 2016 version, you'll find a bit more on the Engage tool and the public input process. That was what was built upon during the update. You'll also find the full listing of the 80 some odd strategies that are not necessarily projects, but recommendations for consider this and move this type of initiative forward within the region.
Terrific.
I was just going to add that this presentation will be posted also to the website. This link will be made available to everybody as well. So
very good. Well, appreciate very much Jeanette and Paul as well for a really comprehensive look at the RMAP. It barely scratched the surface, I'm afraid, but I think of great value to the committee. Are there any other questions or comments from folks who haven't had a chance yet to ask their questions? Very good. Then I think we're at the end of our agenda and ready for adjournment. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have agenda items, please contact Pocky or staff and let us know. I do see one question from Bruce Wright. Bruce, is something you wanted to add here at the end?
Mr. Chairman, I actually would like to talk about a future agenda item, if I might.
We don't have it on the agenda at this point. Why don't we take that offline and go over that, okay?
That'd be fine. Thank you.
Great,
Mr. Chair?
thanks.
This is Carolyn. I think we should have that. I think I've mentioned that before. I think that would be a good thing to add on the end of our agendas is future agenda items.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, we will do that. All right, thanks everyone. And we are hereby adjourned. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Paul?
Thanks, Jeanette.
Really well, yeah. Really well done, Jeanette and Paul.
Yeah, terrific job.